The lecture hall buzzed with quiet conversations as students from 12 different species settled into their seats for another session of galactic military history. Professor Vorth adjusted his spectacles and activated the holographic display that dominated the front wall of the classroom. The blue-skinned Altaran had been teaching this course for nearly 2 decades and took pride in his comprehensive coverage of the galaxy's most significant conflicts. Today we examine the Human-Altaran War of 2387, Vorth announced, his voice carrying easily through the amphitheater-style seating. This conflict serves as an excellent example of technological superiority determining battlefield outcomes. David Chen sat in the third row, one of only 5 humans in the class of 60 students. He had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and whispered comments whenever Earth's military history came up in discussions. Most of his classmates viewed humans as a cautionary tale rather than equals in the galactic community. The holographic display shifted to show a star map with Earth highlighted in red and the Altaran homeworld glowing blue. Vorth gestured with a pointer that cast shadows through the 3-dimensional projection. The war began when human expansion threatened established trade routes, Vorth continued. Earth's primitive vessels posed little direct threat, but their aggressive colonization efforts disrupted commerce throughout the Outer Rim territories. Kentari student raised one of her 4 arms. Professor, weren't the humans simply following standard expansion protocols established by the Galactic Council? Vorth's expression tightened slightly. The protocols existed, yes, but human interpretation of territorial rights proved problematic. They established colonies without proper consultation with existing inhabitants. David shifted in his seat but remained silent. His grandfather had been among the first wave of colonists, and family stories painted a different picture of those early settlements. According to his grandfather, most worlds had been uninhabited or contained only research outposts, the Altaran. Response was swift and decisive, Vorth said, advancing to the next slide. Our fleet, that is, the Altaran fleet, consisted of 200 vessels equipped with plasma cannons and quantum shields. Earth could muster perhaps 50 ships, using outdated fusion drives and kinetic weapons. Murmurs rippled through the classroom. Several students chuckled at what seemed like an absurd mismatch of forces. A Rigelian cadet leaned over to whisper something to his neighbor, both glancing toward David with obvious amusement. The holographic display now showed simplified representations of the opposing fleets. Altaran ships appeared sleek and advanced, while human vessels looked blocky and primitive by comparison. Vorth highlighted key technological differences between the 2 forces: phase cannons versus plasma weapons, chemical rockets versus quantum drives, steel armor versus energy shields. Vorth listed. The outcome should have been predetermined, before the first shot was fired. Should have been, David thought to himself, remembering stories his father had told him about the war's later stages. Something had always seemed off about the official version of events. Though he had never voiced his doubts publicly, Vorth continued his lecture, describing the early battles where Altaran forces achieved quick victories against human defenders. The professor's tone carried a note of pride as he recounted how advanced tactics and superior firepower overwhelmed human resistance at colony after colony. The siege of New Geneva lasted only 6 hours, Vorth said. Human defenders surrendered rather than face complete annihilation. Similar patterns emerged at every major engagement throughout the first year of conflict. A Vulani student raised her hand. Did humans attempt any diplomatic solutions once their military disadvantage became apparent? Multiple overtures were made through neutral parties, Vorth replied. However, human leadership remained defiant despite mounting losses. They seemed to believe some miraculous intervention might change their fortunes. David found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the narrative being presented. His family had lived through this period, and their accounts suggested human morale had remained surprisingly high, even during the worst defeats. Why would a demoralized population maintain such optimism in the face of overwhelming odds? The lecture continued with detailed analysis of major battles, each confirming Altaran technological superiority and tactical brilliance. Vorth displayed casualty figures showing devastating human losses, while Altaran casualties remained minimal throughout most engagements. The final phase of the war began with the assault on Earth itself, Vorth announced, his voice taking on a somber tone. 3 full battle groups converged on humanity's homeworld. Resistance was expected to be fierce but ultimately futile. The holographic display showed Earth surrounded by Alteran vessels. Red indicators marked defensive positions while blue arrows depicted the planned invasion routes. Everything appeared straightforward and methodical. Earth's orbital defenses were neutralized within hours, Vorth continued. Landing forces encountered scattered resistance but nothing approaching organized military opposition. Victory seemed assured. He paused dramatically before advancing to the final slide, which displayed a simple text message. Unconditional surrender, Earth High Command. Faced with inevitable destruction, human leadership chose to spare their population further suffering, Vorth concluded. The surrender document was signed aboard the flagship Resolution. Ending 18 months of conflict, Earth became a protectorate under Alteran administration, until achieving independent status 15 years later. Most students were already gathering their materials, but David remained in his seat studying. The surrender message displayed on the hologram. Something about its brevity and formal language struck him as unusual. Most surrender documents he had seen in other historical studies contained detailed terms and conditions, Professor. David called out as other students filed toward the exits. What happened after the surrender? Vorth paused in the act of shutting down the holographic projector. I'm sorry? After Earth surrendered, David said, standing up slowly. What happened in the weeks and months that followed? Several students had stopped near the doorway, sensing something interesting in the exchange. Vorth seemed momentarily flustered by the question. Standard occupation procedures were implemented, Vorth replied. Alteran administrators took control of major population centers, while human civilian government continued handling local affairs under supervision. But, sir, David pressed, if Earth lost the war completely, why are there human colonies throughout this sector now? When did they regain the right to establish new settlements? The professor's blue skin seemed to darken slightly. The post-war reconstruction period allowed for gradual restoration of human autonomy. These matters were handled through diplomatic channels over several years. I understand that, David said, but I'm curious about the immediate aftermath. Were there any other battles after the surrender? Any resistance movements? What happened to the Alteran occupation forces? Vorth had finished packing his materials and was clearly eager to leave. Young man, the war ended with the surrender. Everything else is merely administrative history. Not relevant to our military studies, Professor, David called as Vorth headed toward the door. Do you have the complete files from that period? I'd be interested in reading more about how the transition was managed. The professor stopped at the threshold and turned back. For just a moment, David thought he saw something like uncertainty, or perhaps even fear, in the older Alteran's eyes. 3DO. Standard textbooks contain all necessary information, Vorth said finally. I suggest you focus on the assigned readings rather than pursuing tangential research. With that, he left the classroom, leaving David standing alone among the empty seats. But as he gathered his own materials, David noticed he wasn't entirely alone. 3 other students had lingered, apparently as intrigued by the professor's evasive responses as he had been. That was interesting, said Lisa, a human engineering student. I've never heard anyone ask follow-up questions about Earth's surrender before. My grandmother lived through that war, added Ben, whose family had immigrated from one of the contested colonies. She always said there were parts of the story that didn't make sense. David looked at his small group of allies and made a decision that would change everything. Want to help me figure out what really happened? 3 days later, David entered the lecture hall with renewed determination and a notebook filled with questions that had kept him awake for most of the previous night. Lisa and Ben flanked him, along with 2 other students who had joined. Their informal investigation group after word spread through the dormitories. Professor Vorth seemed less composed than usual as he prepared his materials. His normally pristine uniform showed wrinkles, and his characteristic confidence appeared somewhat diminished. The holographic projector flickered twice before stabilizing, casting unstable shadows across the front wall. Today we continue our examination of post-conflict reconstruction, Forth announced, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The Human-Alteran War provides excellent examples of successful integration policies following military occupation. David raised his hand immediately. Professor, I've been researching the timeline you presented last week, and I found some discrepancies I'd like to clarify. Vorth's grip on his pointer tightened visibly. Mr. Chen, I believe I made it clear that our focus should remain on the assigned curriculum rather than independent research projects. I understand. Sir, but these aren't obscure details, David replied. I'm questioning some basic facts about the war's conclusion. The classroom had grown unusually quiet. Even students who typically spent lectures engaged in whispered conversations were now paying close attention to the exchange between professor and pupil. Very well, Forth said with obvious reluctance. What specific issues are you raising? David consulted his notebook. According to your lecture, Earth surrendered unconditionally in late 2388, but galactic shipping records show human merchant vessels resuming independent trade operations within 6 months. That seems remarkably fast for a conquered population. Vorth activated the holographic display, showing a standard reconstruction timeline. Efficient administration allowed for rapid economic recovery. Alteran oversight ensured smooth transitions. But sir, Ben interjected from his seat beside David, my family's shipping company was operating during that period. They never reported any Alteran inspections or administrative oversight on their trade routes. The professor's blue skin had taken on a distinctly darker shade. Individual experiences may vary from official policies. Not every aspect of occupation administration was uniformly applied. Lisa raised her hand. Professor, I accessed the Galactic Registry database yesterday. Human colonies established new settlements on 17 worlds between 2389 and 2391. How does that align with protectorate status under Alteran control? Vorth stood frozen for several seconds before responding. The reconstruction process included provisions for limited expansion under careful supervision. Limited expansion? David asked, flipping through his notes. The colonies I found weren't small research outposts. New Shanghai has over 2 million residents, and it was founded in 2390. That's only 2 years after the supposed conquest murmurs began spreading through the classroom as other students started connecting dots they had never noticed before. A Kentari cadet turned to her neighbor and whispered something that caused both to look toward the front of the room with newfound interest. Furthermore, David continued, I checked the Alteran Colonial Administration archives. There's no record of any human worlds being listed as protectorates or occupied territories during the period in question. Vorth's pointer clattered to the floor. Those records may be incomplete or classified for diplomatic reasons, maybe? David pressed. Professor, either Earth was occupied or it wasn't. Either humans were restricted from colonization or they weren't. The evidence suggests the official narrative contains significant inaccuracies. The classroom erupted in excited conversations as students began sharing their own family stories and half-remembered details that had never made sense within the context of Earth's supposed defeat. Several cadets were already accessing their personal data tablets to verify claims being made. Order. Order, Vorth called out, though his voice carried little authority. We need to maintain focus on established historical facts rather than engaging in speculation. With respect, sir, said Tom, a quiet student from the back row who rarely spoke during lectures. These don't sound like speculations. They sound like verifiable discrepancies in the official record. My uncle served on an Alteran patrol ship during the Reconstruction period, added a Rigelian cadet. He mentioned that human space was considered off-limits to all Alteran vessels after 2389. Why would occupying forces be forbidden from entering territory they supposedly controlled? Vorth began pacing behind his desk, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. Diplomatic arrangements following conflicts often involve complex agreements that may not be apparent to outside observers. Professor, David said, standing up from his seat. I think we're beyond diplomatic complexity here. The evidence suggests that either Earth never actually surrendered, or something happened after the surrender that completely changed the balance of power. The entire classroom had gone silent. 60 students from 12 different species waited for their professor's response to an accusation that challenged one of the most fundamental narratives in modern galactic history. Mr. Chen, Vorth said slowly, you are venturing into territory that could be considered seditious questioning of established historical fact. Is seeking truth seditious? David asked. If the facts support the official story, then investigating them should only confirm what we already know. But if the investigation reveals problems with the official story, then shouldn't we want to know what really happened? Lisa stood up beside David. Professor, can you show us the actual surrender document? Not just the summary slide you displayed last week, but the complete text with signatures and terms? Ben joined them. And can we see the Alteran military reports from the occupation period? There should be extensive documentation of administrative activities if Earth was actually under Alteran control for 15 years. More students began standing, as the momentum of doubt spread through the classroom. What about casualty reports from the final battles? Called out someone from the upper rows. If the conquest was so complete, why aren't there detailed records of the fighting on Earth itself? Enough! Vorth shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The outburst was so uncharacteristic that it shocked everyone into immediate silence. The professor stood breathing heavily behind his desk, staring at the sea of questioning faces before him. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his podium. This line of inquiry is inappropriate and potentially dangerous, he said quietly. There are aspects of historical events that are classified for reasons of galactic security and diplomatic stability. So there are classified aspects? David asked. That means there's more to the story than what we've been taught? Vorth looked directly at David with an expression that mixed anger, fear, and something that might have been respect. Mr. Chen, some questions are better left unasked. Some truths are more dangerous than the lies that replace them, Professor, Lisa said gently. We're not trying to cause trouble. We just want to understand what really happened to our people. Your people, Vorth repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I suppose that's what makes this so complicated. He stood in silence for nearly a minute before speaking again. Class dismissed. Mr. Chen, Miss Torres, Mr. Johnson, please remain behind. The rest of you may leave, and I strongly advise against discussing today's conversation outside this classroom. Students filed out quickly, though David noticed many exchanging contact information and making plans to continue their research independently. The three humans, who had been asked to stay behind, waited nervously as the last of their classmates departed. When the door closed behind the final student, Vorth activated a privacy screen around the front of the classroom. The shimmer of energy indicated that their conversation would now be protected from outside monitoring. You have no idea what you're stirring up, he said, slumping into his chair. The official story exists for very good reasons, and challenging it could have consequences none of us are prepared to face. David stepped closer to the professor's desk. Professor, what really happened during the war? Vorth looked up at the three young humans standing before him. For the first time since they had known him, he appeared old and tired rather than confident and authoritative. What happened, he said slowly, was that we learned humanity was far more dangerous than any of us had imagined. And the galaxy has been trying to forget that lesson ever since. The university library's restricted archives section hummed with the quiet efficiency of climate control systems, working to preserve thousands of years of galactic history. David, Lisa, and Ben had spent the past week obtaining special research permits, a process that proved surprisingly difficult given the seemingly academic nature of their inquiry. Access to primary military sources requires faculty sponsorship. The head librarian, an elderly Vulani named Nara, had explained. Professor Vorth's approval came with unusual restrictions regarding your research parameters. David examined the access terminal displaying their authorized search categories. We can review neutral observer reports and general diplomatic correspondence, but all Alteran military records remain classified above our clearance level. At least it's a start, Lisa said, settling into a chair beside the holographic document display. Ben, what did your grandmother say when you asked her about the war again? Ben pulled out a small audio recorder. I convinced her to record some of her memories. Listen to this. His grandmother's weathered voice filled the privacy booth around their research station. The strangest thing about those final months was how quiet everything became. Not peaceful quiet, mind you, but the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without knowing why. The recording continued. Ships stopped coming through our system entirely for almost 3 months. Not Alteran ships, not human ships, nobody. Then one day human merchant vessels started arriving again, flying their routes like nothing had ever happened. But they wouldn't talk about what had occurred during the gap. David paused the playback. 3 months of complete communication blackout, then normal operations resumed. That doesn't match any pattern from other conflicts we've studied. Lisa activated the document search interface. Let's see what the neutral observer reports say about that time period. The Centauri Federation maintained monitoring stations throughout the contested zones. The first batch of Centauri records painted a confusing picture. Regular reports of fleet movements and battle outcomes stopped abruptly in late 2388, replaced by brief status updates, indicating monitoring suspended due to unusual energy phenomena. Unusual energy phenomena? Ben read aloud. What kind of phenomena would cause multiple species to suspend their observation missions simultaneously? David scrolled through additional Centauri documents. Look at this. A scientific survey report from their deep space monitoring network. They detected gravitational anomalies in the Sol system during the same period your grandmother mentioned. Gravitational anomalies could indicate massive fleet movements, Lisa suggested. Maybe the final battle was larger than the official records indicate. Or maybe it indicates something else entirely, Ben said, pointing to another section of the report. This mentions electromagnetic disturbances consistent with stellar activity, but the report notes that Sol showed no signs of solar flare or coronal mass ejection activity during the same time frame. David leaned back in his chair, trying to process the implications. Energy phenomena that looked like stellar activity, but weren't coming from the star itself. That's not something you see in normal space combat. Lisa had moved on to diplomatic correspondence between various neutral species. The Rigelian ambassador to the Galactic Council filed a formal inquiry about unprecedented weapon systems being deployed in the Sol system, but the response was classified at the highest levels. Unprecedented weapon systems, David repeated. Not advanced weapons or superior tactics. Unprecedented meaning something that had never been seen before. Ben was examining casualty reports from the final period of the conflict. Here's something interesting. Alteran losses in the last 3 months of the war were actually higher than in the previous 15 months combined. But all the details are redacted. Higher casualties during what was supposed to be their moment of complete victory, Lisa observed. That makes no sense from a tactical standpoint. David accessed the general timeline of events one more time. According to these neutral observer reports, the last confirmed battle occurred on October 12, 2388. After that date, there's no record of any military engagement anywhere in the contested zone. But the surrender wasn't announced until December 8th, Ben noted. What was happening during those 2 months of silence? Lisa pulled up shipping manifest from human cargo vessels. Trade resumed gradually starting in January 2389. But look at the cargo listings. These ships were carrying industrial equipment and raw materials, not the kind of goods you'd expect. From a defeated population, industrial equipment suggests they were building something, David said. Or rebuilding after some kind of massive destruction. Ben had found additional reports from the Kentari Trade Commission. This is from March 2389. Kentari merchants reported that human space was declared off-limits to all foreign vessels by joint agreement between Earth and Alteran authorities. Joint agreement, not occupation decree. Joint agreement implies negotiation between equals, Lisa pointed out. Why would victorious Alterans need to negotiate with defeated humans about access rights to human territory? David stood up and began pacing around their research station. Every piece of evidence we find makes the official story less plausible. Earth supposedly lost the war, but the aftermath looks more like the conclusion of a peace treaty between equal powers. Or like the Altarans were afraid to enter human space, Ben suggested quietly. The three friends sat in silence for several minutes, contemplating the implications of what they were discovering. Finally, Lisa broke the quiet with a new question. David, what did Professor Vorth mean when he said humanity was more dangerous than anyone had imagined? I don't know, David admitted. But I think we need to find someone who was actually there during the final stages of the war. Someone who witnessed whatever happened that made the Altarans stop fighting. Ben consulted his personal tablet. My grandmother mentioned that some of the old merchant families have connections to people who served in the war. Maybe they could point us toward someone willing to talk. We need to be careful, Lisa warned. Professor Vorth seemed genuinely frightened by our questions. If there really is classified information involved, we could get in serious trouble, David nodded. But we're not trying to steal military secrets or cause political problems. We just want to know the truth about our own history. Sometimes the truth is the most dangerous thing of all, Ben said, echoing something his grandmother had mentioned during their recorded conversation. Lisa began shutting down their research terminal. I think we've learned as much as we can from official sources. The real answers are going to come from people who were there, agreed, David said. But before we start approaching veterans, I want to try one more avenue. Professor Vorth mentioned that some aspects of the war were classified for diplomatic reasons. Maybe we can find someone in the diplomatic corps who knows more about the post-war negotiations. Ben looked up from packing his materials. Actually, I might have a contact there. My uncle works for the human embassy on Centauri Prime. He's not high enough in the hierarchy to know state secrets, but he might be able to point us toward someone who does. It's worth trying, Lisa agreed. The more we learn about the official story, the more obvious it becomes that we're not getting the whole truth. As they prepared to leave the library, David took one last look at the restricted archives terminal. Somewhere in those classified databases lay the real story of what had happened during the final months of the human-Altaran war. He was becoming increasingly certain that whatever the truth might be, it would change everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. Professor Vorth is scared, he said quietly. A war veteran and career academic is frightened by a few students asking questions about historical facts. That tells me we're onto something much bigger than inconsistent records. The question is, Lisa replied, are we prepared for what we might find? David considered her words as they walked through the library's main corridor. Every instinct told him they were approaching something significant and potentially dangerous. But his need to understand the truth about his species' past outweighed his caution. We'll deal with whatever we find, he said finally. The truth about Earth's war can't be more dangerous than the lies we've been living with. The message from Ben's uncle had been cryptically brief. Meet me at the Stellar Cartography Lab tonight at 2200 hours. Come alone and tell no one about this conversation. David felt his pulse quicken as he approached the darkened laboratory, wondering what information had prompted such secrecy. Ambassador Chen waited in the shadows between two massive holographic star maps, his diplomatic uniform replaced by civilian clothing that made him nearly invisible in the dim lighting. David recognized the family resemblance immediately, although Ben's uncle appeared far more tense than anyone in their family photos. You're David, the ambassador said quietly. Ben tells me you've been asking uncomfortable questions about the war. Sir, we're just trying to understand what really happened to Earth, David replied. The official records don't match the evidence we've found. Ambassador Chen activated a portable privacy screen around their location. The evidence doesn't match because the official records are deliberately incomplete. What I'm about to show you is classified at levels that could end careers and start diplomatic incidents. He produced a small data crystal from his jacket pocket. This contains Altaran military files that were never supposed to be declassified. A contact in their foreign ministry provided these documents as part of an unofficial information exchange. David accepted the crystal with trembling hands. How did you get access to something like this? 25 years of diplomatic service. Creates relationships and debts that occasionally prove useful, the ambassador said. But understand that using this information publicly would be considered an act of espionage by the Alteran government. The crystal interfaced with the laboratory's holographic system, displaying file directories labeled with Alteran military designations. David scrolled through hundreds of battle reports, tactical analyses, and casualty assessments from the final months of the war. Start with the file marked Operation Final Victory, Ambassador Chen suggested. That was the Alteran code name for their assault on Earth. The first document appeared to be a standard tactical briefing. 3 Alteran battle groups would converge on Earth from different vectors, overwhelming orbital defenses before establishing control of major population centers. Everything proceeded according to plan through the initial phases of the attack. The early reports match what Professor Vorth taught us, David observed. Alteran forces achieved quick victories against Earth's outer defenses. Keep reading, the ambassador said grimly. Pay attention to the timestamps on the later reports. David advanced through the chronological sequence of battle updates. Alteran commanders reported successful neutralization of orbital weapons platforms, the destruction of defending fleet elements, and the beginning of atmospheric entry operations. Then something changed. The first indication of trouble appeared in a communication from Admiral Korvac, commanding the primary assault force. Human. Defensive response has shifted to unknown parameters. Recommend delaying ground operations pending tactical assessment. Unknown parameters? David read aloud. What kind of defensive response would an experienced military commander describe as unknown? Keep going, Ambassador Chen urged. The next few reports get more interesting. The subsequent military updates painted an increasingly confused picture. Alteran sensors began detecting energy signatures that didn't match any known weapon systems in their databases. Human communications had shifted to frequencies and protocols that seemed to defy conventional physics. Most disturbing of all, several Alteran vessels reported navigation anomalies suggesting localized gravitational distortions. Admiral's log, October 11, 2388, David read from a personal report. Human forces have activated some form of stellar manipulation technology. Our science officers believe they are attempting to weaponize their own star. Recommend immediate withdrawal to safe distance pending evaluation of threat level. David stopped reading and stared at the ambassador. They were trying to turn the sun into a weapon? Not trying, Ambassador Chen corrected. According to these files, they succeeded. The next report describes what the Alteran fleet witnessed. David found the document labeled Emergency Fleet Status Report, Sol System Incident. The formal military. Language couldn't disguise the terror evident in every line of the assessment. At 13:47 hours on October 12th, human forces initiated controlled solar manipulation resulting in directed energy discharge of unprecedented magnitude, David read. Energy beam achieved focus density capable of sterilizing planetary surfaces at ranges exceeding 50 astronomical units. Demonstration blast vaporized asteroid belt targets while maintaining precise directional control. The implications hit David like a physical blow. They turned the sun into a focused death ray. A death ray capable of destroying targets 50 times further away than Earth's distance from the sun. The ambassador confirmed. The Alteran fleet was positioned well within that range. David continued reading through the panicked reports from Alteran commanders. Their most advanced shields couldn't have stopped an attack of that magnitude. Their fastest ships couldn't have outrun a weapon that operated at light speed. For the first time in their military history, the Alterans faced an enemy capable of completely annihilating them without any possibility of retaliation. Listen to this, David said, reading from Admiral Korvac's final report. Human transmission received on all frequencies. We have demonstrated our defensive capabilities. Withdraw your forces beyond the heliopause and we will consider this matter resolved peacefully. Failure to comply will result in immediate implementation of stellar defense protocols against all vessels within our system. They gave the Alterans exactly one chance to leave, Ambassador Chen said, and the Alterans took it. The withdrawal orders were issued within hours. 3 entire battle groups fled the Sol system faster than their engines were designed to operate, many ships suffering mechanical failures. From the strain of emergency acceleration, the most powerful military force in the galaxy had been routed by a species they considered primitive. But the official records say Earth surrendered. David protested. How did this demonstration of overwhelming power become a story about human defeat? Ambassador Chen activated another file on the crystal. This is the classified diplomatic correspondence between Earth and the Alteran. High Command during the months following the withdrawal. Both sides had very good reasons to misrepresent what actually happened. The diplomatic exchanges revealed a complex negotiation between 2 sides who understood they had reached a stalemate. The Alterans possessed superior conventional military technology, but couldn't risk another confrontation with humanity's stellar manipulation capabilities. Earth had demonstrated ultimate defensive power but lacked the fleet strength to project force beyond their own system. The Alterans needed to save face with their allies and subject species, David read from a diplomatic summary. They couldn't admit that a primitive species had forced their retreat through superior firepower. Earth agreed to the fiction of surrender in exchange for immediate recognition as a sovereign power and unrestricted colonization rights. So the surrender was fake? David asked. Completely fictional. The ambassador confirmed. The document Professor Vorth showed your class was created as diplomatic theater. Both sides signed it knowing it would never be enforced. David scrolled through additional files detailing the post-war arrangements. Earth gained everything they had wanted through military victory, while allowing the Alterans to maintain their reputation as galactic military leaders. The price was accepting a false narrative that portrayed humanity as conquered, rather than triumphant. The stellar manipulation technology, David said. What happened to it? Ambassador Chen's expression grew troubled. That's where the story becomes even more complicated. According to these files, the technology was too dangerous for regular use. The energy requirements could destabilize Earth's sun if used repeatedly. So it was a one-time demonstration? One time was enough, the ambassador replied. Every major power in the galaxy now knows that attacking Earth could result in the complete annihilation of their forces. The threat remains even though the weapon can't be used casually. David sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had learned. Professor Vorth was right about humanity being more dangerous than anyone imagined. But he's been teaching the opposite lesson for decades. Professor Vorth was aboard one of the Alteran command ships during the withdrawal. Ambassador Chen revealed. He witnessed the stellar demonstration firsthand. The experience traumatized him so severely that he volunteered to teach the false version of history rather than remember what he actually saw. The pieces were finally falling into place. David understood now why his professor had seemed so frightened by questions about the war's conclusion. Vorth had been present for one of the most terrifying military displays in galactic history, then spent the rest of his career trying to forget it by teaching a sanitized version of events. Why are you telling me this? David asked. Why risk your career to share classified information with a student? Ambassador Chen deactivated the privacy screen and began packing away the data crystal. Because 25 years of diplomatic service has taught me that lies eventually collapse under their own weight. Your generation deserves to know the real reason why humanity is respected throughout the galaxy. What should I do with this information? That's your decision, the ambassador said. But remember that knowledge comes with responsibility. The current arrangement has kept the peace for 50 years. Changing it could have consequences none of us can predict. As David left the stellar cartography lab, his mind raced with questions about what he should do next. He now possessed the truth about humanity's greatest military victory, disguised as their most humiliating defeat. But sharing that truth could destabilize the careful diplomatic balance that had prevented wars for half a century. One thing was certain. He could never look at Professor Vorth the same way again. Professor Vorth's office seemed smaller and more cluttered than David remembered, filled with mementos from a long academic career and personal items that suggested a life lived far from his Alteran homeworld. The professor sat behind his desk reviewing student papers, but his movements appeared mechanical and distracted. "Mr. Chen," Vorth said without looking up, "I was expecting you would come to see me eventually. Your questions in class have been quite persistent." David closed the door behind him and activated the privacy screen. "Professor, I know about the Alteran military files. I know what really happened during the final battle at Earth." Vorth's pen stopped moving across the paper he had been grading. For several long seconds he remained frozen, then slowly set the pen aside and looked up at David with eyes that seemed much older than his apparent age. "I wondered how long it would take," Vorth said quietly. 50 years of teaching the official version, and finally a student discovers the truth. I suppose I should feel relieved. "Professor, were you really there?" David asked, settling into the chair across from Vorth's desk. "Were you aboard one of the Alteran ships during the withdrawal?" Vorth leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "I was a young tactical officer aboard the flagship Resolution, fresh from the Naval Academy, full of confidence in Alteran military superiority. The assignment to command the human conquest was supposed to be the beginning of a distinguished career." His voice carried a weight of memory that made David understand why the professor had seemed so uncomfortable discussing the war. "What was it like, being there when humanity demonstrated their stellar weapon?" "Terrifying beyond anything you could imagine," Vorth replied. "We had sensors capable of analyzing the energy output from a stellar manipulation event. The numbers were so extreme that our computers initially rejected them as instrument failures." Vorth stood up and walked to his office window, gazing out at the campus where students from dozens of species studied together in apparent harmony. "I was responsible for tactical assessment of enemy capabilities. When the humans activated their weapon, every analysis I had ever learned became worthless. The official reports mentioned energy beams capable of sterilizing planets at 50 astronomical units," David said. "Were those figures accurate?" "Conservative estimates," Vorth said without turning around. "Our science officers calculated that a sustained burst could have destroyed targets at over 100 AU with minimal power adjustment. They weren't just manipulating their star, Mr. Chen. They had achieved complete control over stellar output." David tried to imagine the scale of power being described. The ability to harness and direct the energy of an entire star represented a technological achievement that dwarfed anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. "What was the mood aboard your ship when you realized what you were facing?" Vorth returned to his desk and sat down heavily. "Panic initially, then a kind of numb acceptance that we were completely outmatched. Admiral Korvac spent 6 hours in emergency consultation with the High Command before issuing withdrawal orders. 6 hours seems like a long time when facing an existential threat," David observed. "The Admiral was trying to find some tactical option that didn't involve admitting defeat," Vorth explained. "He ran simulations of every possible attack scenario: long-range bombardment, stealth infiltration, coordinated multi-vector assault. Every simulation ended with the complete destruction of our forces." Vorth opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a small holographic projector. "I've kept something from that day that I've never shown to anyone, a recording from our tactical sensors during the demonstration." He activated the device, filling the office with a 3-dimensional image of the Sol system as seen from the Alteran fleet's perspective. Earth appeared as a small blue dot, surrounded by the expanding energy signature of its star. "Watch the timestamp," Vorth said. "This is the moment the humans activated their weapon." The holographic sun suddenly changed from a normal stellar display to something that defied easy description. Streams of plasma began converging toward a single point on the star's surface, while maintaining perfect stability in the remaining solar mass. "Our sensors detected localized gravitational manipulation on a scale that should have been impossible," Vorth narrated. "They were essentially creating artificial gravity wells to focus stellar material into a coherent energy stream." The demonstration continued for exactly 17 minutes according to the timestamp. During that time, the Focused solar energy vaporized 3 large asteroids at progressively greater distances, each target selected to prove the weapon's range and precision. The final target was destroyed at 87 astronomical units, Vorth said as the recording ended. That asteroid was farther from Earth than our most distant picket ships. The humans weren't just demonstrating their weapon, they were proving they could destroy our entire fleet simultaneously. David sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what he had witnessed. Professor, how did you end up teaching military history after experiencing something like that? Vorth's expression grew pained. I left military service within a year of returning to Altaran space. The experience had shattered my faith in everything I thought I knew about warfare and technology. Teaching seemed like a way to make sense of military history without having to participate in it directly. But you've been teaching the false version of the war for decades, David pointed out. Doesn't that conflict with your desire to understand military history? Initially, I believed the false narrative was necessary for galactic stability, Vorth admitted. The Altaran government convinced me that revealing humanity's true capabilities would trigger an arms race that could destabilize the entire galaxy. And now? Vorth considered the question for several moments. Now I think the lie has become more dangerous than the truth. Students like you are discovering inconsistencies in the official story, and the cover-up is becoming harder to maintain. David leaned forward in his chair. Professor, what would happen if the real story became public knowledge? Unknown, Vorth replied honestly. Some species might attempt to develop similar stellar manipulation technology. Others might seek to form alliances with Earth for protection. The balance of power that has maintained peace for 50 years would certainly change. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Vorth smiled sadly. Perhaps not. I've spent so many years afraid of change that I may have lost sight of whether the current situation is actually worth preserving. The students in your class deserve to know the truth about their own species. History, David said. Humans have been living with a narrative of defeat when they should be proud of achieving the greatest military victory in galactic history. You're right, Vorth agreed. But the decision about what to do with that truth belongs to your generation, not mine. I've carried this secret long enough. David stood up to leave, then paused at the door. Professor, when you were aboard that Altaran ship watching humanity demonstrate stellar manipulation, what did you think about humans as a species? Vorth was quiet for so long that David wondered if he had heard the question. Finally, the professor spoke. I thought that any species capable of controlling stars was too dangerous to be allowed to exist, he said quietly. And then I realized that any species capable of controlling stars but choosing not to use that power aggressively was too valuable to lose. That's why you've been protecting the secret? That's why I've been waiting for the right student to discover it, Vorth corrected. The truth was always going to come out eventually. I just wanted to make sure it was revealed by someone who understood the responsibility that comes with such knowledge. David left the professor's office with a new understanding of the burden that Vorth had carried for half a century. The old Altaran had witnessed humanity's greatest triumph and then spent decades living with the knowledge that his own people's survival depended on humans choosing restraint over revenge. Now that burden was shifting to David and his generation. They possessed the truth about humanity's stellar weapon and the power to reshape galactic understanding of human capabilities. The question was whether they were wise enough to handle that responsibility. The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation as students filed in for what many suspected would be an unusual class session. Word had spread through the dormitories that Professor Vorth had requested additional time for a special presentation about the Human-Altaran War, and the mysterious nature of the announcement had attracted students from other courses. David, Lisa, and Ben sat in their usual seats, sharing nervous glances as they waited to see how their professor would handle the truth they had uncovered. Behind them, the lecture hall filled to capacity with cadets eager to witness what promised to be a memorable lesson. Professor Vorth entered precisely on schedule, but his demeanor had changed dramatically from previous classes. Instead of his typical confident stride, he moved slowly and deliberately, carrying himself like someone preparing to shed a tremendous burden. Today, we will conclude our examination of the human-Alteran War, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater. However, I must begin with an apology. The version of events I have taught for the past 20 years contains significant omissions that have rendered my lessons fundamentally incomplete. Murmurs rippled through the assembled students. Several cadets from other species exchanged confused looks, unsure what to make of their professor's unusual opening statement. Mr. Chen, Vorth said, looking directly at David. Your questions about the war's conclusion forced me to confront the fact that historical truth cannot be indefinitely suppressed in favor of political convenience. The real story of humanity's conflict with my people deserves to be told accurately. David felt his pulse quicken as every student in the lecture hall turned to look at him. He had expected Professor Vorth to reveal the truth eventually, but not in such a public forum with so many witnesses. The official narrative describes Earth's surrender and subsequent occupation by Alteran forces, Vorth continued. This version of events was created through diplomatic agreement between both governments, but it bears no resemblance to what actually occurred during the final stages of the war. The holographic display activated, showing the familiar star map of the Sol system. But instead of the standard tactical overview, this projection included detailed sensor readings and energy signatures that had never appeared in previous lectures. I was present during the events I am about to describe, Vorth said. I served as a tactical officer aboard the Alteran flagship Resolution during what we believed would be the final assault on Earth. What we witnessed that day changed everything we thought we knew about human capabilities. A Kantari student raised her hand. Professor, are you saying the official historical records are incorrect? I am saying the official records are deliberately falsified, Vorth replied. The truth was classified at the highest levels by both governments for reasons that will become apparent. As I explain what really happened, the holographic display shifted to show 3 Alteran battle groups converging on Earth from different vectors. Our invasion force consisted of over 200 vessels equipped with the most advanced weapons and defensive systems in the galaxy. Human resistance was expected to be minimal based on their demonstrated technological limitations. David watched his classmates' reactions as Professor Vorth described the early phases of the assault. Everything matched the previous lessons until the professor reached the events of October 12, 2388. At approximately 1300 hours, our sensors detected unusual energy patterns emanating from Earth's star, Vorth said. Initially, we dismissed these readings as instrument malfunctions, since the detected energy levels exceeded anything in our databases. The holographic projection changed to display the actual sensor recordings from that day. Students throughout the lecture hall leaned forward as they watched the sun transform from a normal stellar body into something that defied easy categorization. Human forces had achieved controlled manipulation of stellar plasma, Vorth explained. They were focusing the energy output of their entire star into a coherent, directable beam capable of destroying targets at interplanetary distances. Gasps echoed through the lecture hall as the implications became clear. Lisa whispered something to Ben that David couldn't hear over the general commotion spreading through the assembled students. The demonstration lasted 17 minutes. Vorth continued. During that time, human forces destroyed 3 asteroids at progressively greater distances. The final target was vaporized at a range of 87 astronomical units, proving their weapon could eliminate our entire fleet simultaneously. A Rigelian cadet stood up from his seat. Professor, are you claiming that humans possess technology capable of weaponizing stars? I am not claiming it, Vorth replied. I am stating it as verified fact based on direct observation and sensor analysis. The technological achievement represented by controlled stellar manipulation exceeds anything previously thought possible. The lecture hall erupted in excited conversations as students attempted to process what they were hearing. David noticed that several cadets were already accessing their personal communicators, presumably to share this revelation with friends and family. Order, please, Vorth called out. There is more to this story that you need to understand. The conversations gradually subsided as students focused their attention back on their professor. Following the demonstration, Admiral Korvac received a transmission from Earth High Command offering a single opportunity for peaceful withdrawal. The alternative was immediate implementation of stellar defense protocols against all vessels within the Sol system. The entire Alteran fleet withdrew within 6 hours. Vorth continued. We had no choice. Our most advanced shields could not have stopped an attack of that magnitude, and our fastest ships could not have outrun a weapon that operated at light speed. Ben raised his hand. Professor, if the Alterans were forced to retreat, how did the war end with Earth's surrender? An excellent question, Vorth acknowledged. The answer involves one of the most complex diplomatic arrangements in galactic history. Both sides had compelling reasons to misrepresent what had actually occurred. The holographic display now showed diplomatic correspondence between Earth and the Alteran High Command during the months following the withdrawal. The Alterans needed to maintain their reputation as the galaxy's premier military power. They could not admit that a supposedly primitive species had forced their retreat through superior firepower. Earth faced a different problem. Vorth explained. Their stellar weapon was too dangerous for regular use. The energy requirements could destabilize their star if employed repeatedly. They had achieved the ultimate deterrent, but one that could only be used in the most extreme circumstances. David found himself nodding as the diplomatic logic became clear. So both sides agreed to the fiction of surrender to protect their respective interests. Precisely, Vorth confirmed. Earth gained everything they wanted through military victory while allowing the Alterans to save face with their allies and subject species. The surrender document was pure diplomatic theater. A Vulani student near the back of the lecture hall called out, Professor, why are you revealing this information now? Isn't it still classified? Vorth's expression grew thoughtful. Because 50 years of teaching false history has convinced me that the truth is more important than political convenience. Your generation deserves to know the real reason why humanity is respected throughout the galaxy. The stellar manipulation technology remains a closely guarded secret, he continued. But the fact that it exists has influenced every major diplomatic decision involving Earth for the past 5 decades. Every species in the galaxy knows that attacking humanity could result in complete annihilation. Lisa stood up from her seat. Professor, does this mean humans won the war? It means humans achieved something unprecedented in galactic military history, Vorth replied. They forced a technologically superior enemy to retreat through demonstration of absolute defensive superiority. Whether you call that victory or deterrence is a matter of perspective. The lecture hall had grown remarkably quiet as students contemplated the implications of what they had learned. David looked around at his classmates' faces, seeing expressions that ranged from awe to confusion to excitement. What does this mean for our understanding of current galactic politics? Asked Tom from the back row. It means that many of the diplomatic arrangements you take for granted exist because humanity possesses the ultimate deterrent weapon, Vorth explained. The balance of power that has prevented major wars for 50 years depends on everyone understanding that Earth cannot be conquered through conventional military force. Professor Vorth deactivated the holographic display and faced his students directly. I have spent 20 years teaching you the official version of history because I believed the truth was too dangerous to share. Recent events have convinced me that the lie has become more dangerous than the reality. David raised his hand. Professor, what should we do with this information? That decision belongs to your generation, Vorth replied. But remember that knowledge comes with responsibility. The truth about human capabilities could change the galaxy in ways none of us can predict. As students began filing out of the lecture hall, David remained in his seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Professor Vorth had publicly revealed one of the galaxy's most closely guarded secrets, potentially triggering consequences that could reshape interstellar relations. Mr. Chen, Vorth called as David prepared to leave. Thank you for having the courage to ask the right questions. The truth was always going to emerge eventually, I'm glad it was revealed by someone who understood the importance of seeking accurate answers. David nodded respectfully to his professor, then joined the stream of students exiting the lecture. Halt. Behind him, he could hear excited conversations as cadets from dozens of species discussed the implications of learning that humanity had never actually been defeated. The official story of Earth's surrender had been exposed as diplomatic fiction. In its place stood the truth about humanity's greatest military achievement. David wondered whether the galaxy was ready for that reality.